Liza P. I like this game. Like, a lot. I've played for over 120 hours at this point, and it was one of the first games I've ever gotten all achievements on. Stamina is one of the most important features in Soulslikes, with almost everything using it. Guarding, dodging, running, and most importantly, swinging the weapon requires stamina to do, as well as a few more things. Now in Liza P, there's no sorcery class like Dark Souls, so what can you do? Well, not a lot. But there's enough to do damage, like Legion, Consumables, Spectres, Fables, and most surprisingly, Fatal attacks all don't require stamina. When we start the game, it's not really a hard choice when picking the starting class. We pick the one with the most HP and the least stamina, the Sweeper class. Starting with the Great Sword of Fate and a decent stat distribution, we then proceed with the game. At this point, there are only a few pickups and a left armor steel for damage, and because of this, it actually makes the early game pretty difficult. Going through Crouch Station is pretty easy. Just walking through all the enemies to clear the path and unlock the shortcut. And at this point, I use Last Resort to respawn. I guess now is a good time to explain how Last Resort works, and what I would do in the case where I accidentally use stamina in the run. Last Resort is an item which instantly ends your life, which does not sound amazing, but it has its uses. You instantly get sent back to your last Stargazer you rest at, this game's bonfire, but you drop all your Urgo and Fable where you died or you use Last Resort. You can always go back to where you died to pick up all your Urgo and Fable that you dropped. So if you didn't die too far away, there's not too much penalty in dying. However, if you die again without picking it up, you'll lose half the Urgo you could have picked up and all the Fable you had. Now in the case that stamina is accidentally used, this actually makes a pretty good penalty, because losing Fable usually leads to needing more consumables to get the Fable back, which then leads to needing to farm more Urgo or consumables if I run out. And losing half the Urgo means I will lose minutes or even hours of Urgo if I was to accidentally dodge, run, or swing, which would lead to even more time needing to be sunk into grinding if I wanted to get back the Urgo. At this point, using Last Resort is actually a pretty good way to get back my Legion after getting the shortcut to the first elite enemy, which is the first major wall in this run. At this point, I have 5 uses of the left armor steel and a few items to use, which is almost barely enough to defeat the policeman. So after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Legion uses and 1 Fable, 2 Fables, we defeated him, not even close. This fight gives us a fame upgrade and the Crouch Station key to progress through the game. Walking out into the open, we get the Stargazer and level up a few things. Capacity and Motivity. To anyone who's played this game, Capacity may seem a little odd to level up for this challenge. For the most part, Capacity is mainly used to increase your weight and a few other benefits which are not that significant. Weight would affect the speed at which stamina is regenerated and the dodge speed, both of which are useless to me. So why am I leveling up Capacity for this run? Well, it's for the other benefits that I mentioned before. Capacity has a benefit of giving the most Legion per skill level, at a whopping 3 Legion per capacity. Meanwhile, the left armor still uses 36 Legion per usage, so in reality, it's not great. But because I had 213 Legion at base level, going from 213 to 216 Legion lets me go from 5 uses of the left armor steel to 6 uses. This is a whole 20% increase in damage. Motive on the other hand is pretty simple. It increases your strength, which then increases damage of the Legion. Going through the rest of Crouch Station is a pretty simple walk to the end, picking up items on the way and reaching the next Stargazer. At the Stargazer, there's a merchant before the first boss, and a lot of items I'm going to need to buy from him. Here is the first time I'm going to need to farm, and probably the slowest area I could have done it in too. At this area, there's only 4 enemies around, and at the very end, I used Last Resort to respawn at the Stargazer faster. This would end up taking a long time, but once I finally get enough Urgo for 3 throwing cells, the Puppet Saber, and 1 more level, I burst down the door to the boss fight to meet the Prayer Master, and promptly die. I had enough damage for the fight, but I just got hit too many times. So I farmed some Olgo to get back items and levels, and attempted again. This time it was a bit easier with a little better timing and spacing, and we were able to beat him down with 2 electric shock procs, 1 fatal, and a lot of Fable catalysts. Electric shock is a status element, along with overheat and decay, which increases the physical damage and electric damage taken by enemies when procced. Because of this, I made sure to use my Legion Arm and Fable after the enemy had electric shock to increase the damage I was dealing and overall save items and Olgo. After popping the Basel for some quick Olgo and lying to the door, I got the Moonface Pocket Watch from Sophia and dumped all my Olgo into 6 levels of motive. Along with that, I leveled up the Great Sword, got some Olgo from Antonio, and got the Puppet String, which is not much of an upgrade. Now, in Elysian Boulevard, we encountered the first decent farming area, right in the beginning of the area. With 5 enemies here, taking 30 seconds to defeat them all, and having a drop table of 4 different consumables and throwables, it's actually a pretty good farming area, so I spent a lot of time here between bosses. Traveling through Elysian Boulevard is pretty simple too. There wasn't too much trouble when it came to the first 2 shortcuts, and we picked up the fame upgrade on the way. But the next area of Elysian Boulevard sucked. There were just so many throwing star enemies that took me 3 tries just to walk through it, and that was just for pure luck. But on another note, did you know that if you walk past this doorway, you'll lose all aggro from the enemies previously? After abusing the doorway, I picked up an armor and amulet in the area, and then got to the next boss, the Mad Donkey. After I farmed enough for 8 more levels and 12 total throwing cells, it took me 1 try actually. 4 throwing cells, 2 Fable charges, and all my Legion. But this wasn't the actual amount of tries I did for the boss, as I did in my previous run, which took me 4 tries and a lot of trial and error to learn it. His endless stamina bar and long reach made it very difficult to get any punches or throw any consumables when I was first learning it. But why I didn't continue this run was cause I used stamina in another boss later on. Reaching the city hall, I'm able to quickly get to the next boss gate, before getting everything I needed to prepare for it. There was the NPC baby quest, the amulet pickups, the butterfly hidden moonstone for another weapon level, and farming Olgo for levels and items, and the fight actually ended up being pretty clean. Scrapped Watchman is normally one of my favorite fights, and so I know when I have the window to lay some canisters under him, and when I can attack him for some damage. This fight was the first fight to have a Spectre available as well, and with how this challenge has been going so far, they were going to be really important. With these Spectres, I'm able to do 2 very important things. The first one is obvious, splitting the aggro of the boss. But another one is to block the boss along the way, which allows me to freely throw some consumables or quickly switch aggro from me to the Spectre at the beginning of the fight. I wasn't able to proc electric shock against the boss, but in the end, it wasn't necessary. The damage and the consumables and everything else I had was just enough to get through his health bar. And to be completely honest, this was where the last run died, where I learned that Perfect Guard does in fact use stamina, even if it's a Fable. But finally, I am able to utilize PO gain upgrades and quartz. But because of the lack of stamina, many of the different effects were not that useful to me. So, for now, upgrading to Fable damage and Legion regen should suffice. Going through the walkway to the factory and picking up the key on the way, more throwing enemies are along the path, and they are really a pain in this run. The factory itself was not too bad, with a lot of enemies being too oblivious to see Pinocchio just prancing at them. The biggest worry I had at this point was just the fireballs. This was the mandatory ball trap area in the game, which had areas on both sides which you would be safe in. These save zones would be pretty easy to get to with running, but without running it would be a lot more and I'm done. I guess it wasn't that bad. From here I went to pick up all the quartz available around the area and flip some switches. But in this area there's a total of 3 different bosses. One of these bosses were actually really easy, the robot of the future. His attacks are slow and easy to read, so it's not too bad of a fight with no stamina, giving me a quartz. The next two bosses, however, are pretty difficult. There is an optional boss called the Survivor, which, if I can beat him, I can skip a boss later in the game. So I thought this one might be easier. But I couldn't be more wrong. His attacks are so fast and unrelenting, and his boss room is just too small. It was so difficult to actually get any time to use my Legion, Fable, or even throw any consumables. So I decided that maybe the other boss would be easy to beat. This final boss would be the true boss of the area, King's Flame Fuko, or however his name goes. This would be a good time to say that this run was done in version 1.2.0.0, which was before the changes to this fight and before the additions of any quartz in the shop. This fight was actually pretty difficult. He has a lot of moves which have a 360-degree reach, so I can't just walk up behind him and use Legion. He runs around a lot, and his desperation move is one giant AoE of fire, which does a lot of damage and is hard to run from, and it procs Overheat. Overheat is a pretty straightforward status element which does damage over time, but can be put out faster by rolling, which I obviously cannot do. So after I lose to him once, I grinded some items and got a new converter and a couple more levels. At this point, I'm now level 45, which is a little over level, but now I'm ready. The fight started off pretty normal. Block him with the Spectre, proc Electric Shock, and use physical damage after I proc it. The fire from him was still pretty scary, taking out the Spectre quickly from Overheat, but with a few shock cells, Legion, Fable, and some sawtoothed wheels, the boss goes down pretty fast. This fight gives me Flamebug as a reward, a Flamethrower Legion. Its damage isn't great right now, but it does damage over time, which can be nice sometimes. It has a high cost of Legion, and the time waiting for an enemy to die from fire damage is a downside though. Now it should be a nice calm walk to the next area. Yeah, calm. But after all my deaths, I am able to reach the next area. Eventually. But the elite enemy catching up and stopping me from resting at the Stargazers becomes very common, and usually costs quite a few consumables to defeat them. The Atoned is the next boss, but she isn't too hard. She can attack pretty fast, but has long breaks between her combos. This makes walking away from her then back in to get a few hits a pretty good strategy. And she also gets staggered pretty easily, which makes it much easier than most other bosses at this point. After the tram ride, which takes over a minute, I reach the Path of Misery, right before the Church of Angelico. This area introduces the Caucasus, who are pretty weak, but very fast. Remember how a little bit ago I said Flamebug's damage was pretty bad? Well, these enemies are especially weak to fire, so maybe it would have some uses in this run. The good thing about these enemies is that I am able to walk straight to the Church of Angelico pretty easily, as these enemies usually have to charge up before they start running at me, letting me walk all the way to the door and open it, and get the cube to help later on. The elite enemy in the next area is a bit annoying however. He is as fast as all the other Caucasus, but has the HP of any normal elite enemy. After fisting my way through him, I got to the mandatory platforming part of every Souls game. These thin walkways were riddled with enemies which would throw whatever lunch they had at me, ready to knock me down to my death or even just another 5-minute time waste just to climb all the way back up. These enemies weren't particularly strong, but I did die once or twice while climbing up the tower. However, it wasn't actually as bad as I thought. Most of these enemies that could knock me down could be taken out with a throwing cell and maybe a few more additional items. This next elite enemy, however, was actually one I have no idea how to beat consistently in a normal playthrough, but I also did plan this one. When first planning this, I just planned to use Full Might to burn the enemy as he didn't have his shield up. But I didn't know if I had enough for them to spare. Plus, I didn't know where I could farm Foamite. But if I did know and maybe did a little research before, I would have been less cautious about using them. So instead, I threw all those throwing cells I had, as well as many sawtooth wheels from this upper platform. And then afterwards just stood at the doorway with Flameborg and bombed him down for easy quartz. For beating this enemy, I also got the first craft supply box, and got to get to the church library, which was filled with decay and more enemies. However, this area honestly isn't that interesting, and I have another 25 hours of gameplay to script, so in the 5 minutes of walking, I just got to Alidor to buy Extreme Modification and Holy Sword of the Arc, as well as the Archbishop Holy Mark and a Fame upgrade. After giving the Holy Mark to the Nun and using my quartz, I did some testing and found that the +0 Holy Arc did more damage per Fable than my Great Sword of Fate at +3. So I ended up getting enough material to get the sword to +2. But this was also where I found out that there was a downside to not upgrading capacity outside of Legion. It may not be noticeable in a normal playthrough, but capacity also affects the speed at which you walk, and there was no way for me to avoid attacks other than walking out of the range of the attacks, so having as much walking speed as possible was really important to me. But even with the speed increase from reducing my weight, the next boss was not going to be easy. Archbishop Andreas was a very big boss in a very small room. It was a very annoying fight to try to find room to attack him up close, as well as not get pinned against the wall and comboed to death. His range was really big, and his damage was pretty high for my defenses at the time. He is also able to proc a new status ailment, Decay, which is a bit annoying. Just like Overheat, it also does damage over time, however not as much damage, but in exchange, it will decay the weapon durability which you are holding. While Decay wasn't too bad to manage, I had to be careful not to get decayed too many times so that my weapon wouldn't break before I used any fables. But as careful as I was, and even with a Spectre in the fight with me, it does not take very much for him to beat me with much trouble. The next time I fight him, I only had 2 throwing cells and not even full fable. This would be a really big decrease to my damage, but after getting him to his second phase, I was willing to risk everything I had saved up just to beat him. Using up all my Foamite, Fable, and throwing cells I had left, I was able to beat him after proccing Overheat on him 3 times, with not even half my HP left. Next up is Moonlight Town, which is not terrible, but it has a few points which are really annoying. One of the first enemies in the area is a Carcass Bear, which constantly respawns. Normally, I would just run through the area and ignore it, but I can't run fast enough to get past him. And when he's right next to me, he can just get me stuck in a combo, which I can't run from and just end up dying. But with the way the path circles around, I was able to go through the bottom path and avoid his aggro altogether. After some quick platforming, which is barely possible, I am in the Malum district. For the first half of the area, the game was nice enough to let me have some companions who will carry me and kill all the enemies for me. Because of these companions, I am able to save most of my legion and items for the next 3 enemies. After defeating the elite enemy and getting a useless amulet, I was able to get a quartz and a phone cardon along the way, as well as opening a shortcut which I will need later on as a result of my lack of HP from the elite fight. The second time around, I'm able to get the best shortcut in the area as well as the best merchant in the game, which will come very useful in this run. The Malum District merchant sells almost every throwable in the game, and an indefinite amount of them at that. Because of this, most of my damage will come from him in exchange for a few thousand Olgo each time I want an inventory of items. After some farming and quartz management for battle and more heals, it is time for the next boss, or bosses, the Black Rabbit Brotherhood. This is one of the mandatory Soulslike gang fights which have multiple bosses at the same time, each one spawning around 25%, 50%, and 75% of the HP of the eldest. I thought this fight was gonna be more difficult, with multiple enemies at the same time, but with the eldest being the only one you need to beat, and with the damage of the consumables and effects of fables, it only took 33 seconds to beat the boss. A boss which some people struggle with because of the multiple enemies at the same time, was taken down in less than a minute with no stamina. This really shows the power of consumables. As a reward for this fight, it gave me a painting, a quartz which I used to give me more throwables, and the gold coin tree. Most of these coming in very useful. The next area is Rosa Isabelle Street. Going through this area, you'll hear my favorite soundtrack in the game, Fascination, while fighting a very fast enemy, the White Lady. Normally, with blocking and dodging, she's pretty weak and easy to deal with, as you can block most of the attacks she does. However, in this run, she just stun locks me and makes it very difficult to do anything. So, after the first miserable attempts, I picked up a quartz and a legion plug, which I used the quartz to give me more defense while using fables, and an extra amulet slot. I then had to farm for over 30 minutes, just to get enough items to attempt her 3 more times. And even after the final attempt, I had a really close call in getting stun locked, and only had a few items left. With how much she dodged and moved around, it made stalkers in the future seem really annoying and miserable to deal with. As a consolation, after the White Lady, there was a quartz nearby, which was not too hard to pick up, allowing me to get a bit more Ergo per enemy I kill. This would allow me to buy maybe 1 or 2 more items by the time I started grinding Ergo, which happened a lot. After picking up a quick wedding ring and a shortcut, we now head to the most annoying part of Rosa Isabelle Street. This street has the worst optional boss in the game, 4 puppets with flamethrowers, and 2 puppets which rapidly tossed grenades at me. With no spin available, this will make this path a really big challenge. These flamethrowers dealt damage really quickly, and these grenades constantly stun locked me. Along with the mad clown puppet, this path was actually a really big pain. On my 3rd time around, I made it past them all and opened the opera house door. But why was the mad clown still aggroed on me? He followed me all the way into the opera house and stopped me from resting at the Stargazer. I actually had to beat him this time, and I couldn't just walk past him. He was not that difficult to beat actually. With the number of consumables I could chuck at him, 2 staggers, and some consumables actually just brought him down relatively quickly. And then I proceeded to die 2 more times to the other enemies, because they actually stun locked me constantly. But once I finally passed through the street, the opera house was actually a pretty quick walk. I was able to apply my 2 quartz I got from the Trinity door and the clown. Finally, we reached the final boss of the area, the King of Puppets. He isn't too bad outside of his infinite range. A lot of the previous strategies worked pretty well on him, blocking his movement with the Spectre, single tapping Fable, and applying Electric Shock before doing any physical damage to maximize the damage up I could do. However, I had to be methodical with how many items I used to beat the boss because of his 2nd phase Romeo, where his moves are much faster and leave no room for me to breathe. First time round, I ended up dying the first 10 seconds of reaching Romeo, but on my 2nd attempt, my Spectre was actually really helpful, and we ended up beating him relatively quickly. Honestly, I was really worried about this fight. Romeo normally is a pain to fight, especially with his long, quick desperation move. However, I never saw it, which honestly was a real disappointment as I was preparing for it, but I would take any shortcuts I got for this challenge. With this boss defeated, I was able to pick up what was most likely the best amulet for this run, the Triumvirate Amulet, which improves legions significantly. While grinding for the next area, I found a new grinding spot, and along with the Falcon Eyes, would make Urgo a lot faster than the previous area. With the lack of running around and swinging my weapons, I would need to keep finding more optimized Urgo farming paths, just to make Urgo a little faster with the restrictions I have in place. The next area is Lorenzini Arcade, which the path to and in the arcade was both really annoying. Sure, on the way there, the puppets took a really long time before they would aggro onto me as they were all sulking for the King of Puppets' death. But with how long I was beside them, it would make most of the enemies really difficult to run away from. But I gotta say, I love invulnerability when I open doors. The arcade itself had many required things you need to do before opening every other door, from keys to elite enemies which are forced. Some of these forced fights are much harder without sprinting, as the attack chains usually combo into each other constantly. One of these fights was just a caucus enemy which I fought before Malum, albeit in a small arena, which wasn't too difficult. But the other enemy was the Jester, which most people have considered the most annoying enemy in the game, with a hook which leads to multiple hits in a row constantly. The Jester took way too many consumables, but with the help of the caucus in the gel cells, I was able to take him down. And before saying just to let the caucus beat him, their damage is so random that I might as well just hope I could beat him with just sawtooth wheels rather than rely on them, with how many times they just die or they just don't do damage to him. And with this Jester's defeat, this brings me to the Grand Exhibition, which has one of the funniest theme songs in the game. With a newly upgraded +3 Holy Sword of Arc, I slowly walked through the halls, getting stun-locked by all the enemies which blocked the path. Honestly, even with how annoying the enemies are, I was able to just walk through and pick up Quartz, Trinity Key, and the Crop Box, which gave another Quartz. This was also the point I found out that amulets which give damage based on the enemy types do not work with legions. This whole time I could have been using a different amulet to lighten my load to walk faster, or just give more HP and survivability. The boss of the Grand Exhibition is Champion Victor, which was not a problem with stamina, as most of his moves are slow and can be rolled out of. However, I didn't have that luxury in this run. His moves are still slow and readable, but need much more preparation to walk out of it. Although it only took me 2 runs to beat him, it was a lot more stressful than I thought, because of the amount of damage he did and how he would just not stagger at all in the second phase. But at least now, I'm headed to the Barren Swamp, which has many useful items, but also the boss which gave me one of the most troubles in my first run. But before heading to the swamp, I did get one Legion upgrade, which I thought would have been a really smart idea on how to pass through the swamp later on. Just like every other region in this run, the Barren Swamp was a very annoying area to walk through, because of all the enemies you had, dogs, bayonets, and elite enemies in the first half. These dogs moved way too fast, and these bayonets would shoot me while I was just trying to walk away from these dogs. But here is where my Legion came in handy, a bridge which would fall if I walked over it. So I used the puppet string to zip across using the enemy across the bridge. It didn't help that this tower was full of enemies though, but at least my second time through, I was able to get through the tower and get the shortcut, so I didn't need to go through it again. The second part of the swamp has many different pools of acid, all of which give me corruption status and slows me more than I already am. This area at least has 2 puppets of the future, which both give 1 quartz each, but with a cannon constantly shooting, it is impossible for me to fight them easily just yet. So before attempting to fight them, I first just pick up a Vanini box and head to the next part, which is a carcass infested area. There's another bridge in this area which, like before, would fall if I walked through the middle of it. However, if I walked on the very edge, I would be safe, which kinda made my trace on puppet string not that useful anymore. But other than this small thing, I now need to go through one of the hardest sections in the area, the Indiana Jones copy of Rolling Boulders. There were just so many different sections of boulders I needed to walk through in this area, all of which were either exactly the length to walk through it, or actually too short to walk through it before the next boulder came down. To get through this, I needed to use some specific turns and falls in order to survive and get the shortcut, so I didn't need to walk through it all over again. So after getting through the boulder area, barely surviving the next Pinocchio enemy, taking out a cannon, and reaching right before the next boss enemy, I got the couple of quotes I missed from the Puppet of Future I skipped earlier. Now it is time for the green monster of the swamp. This was honestly the first difficult boss. He moves super fast, does a lot of damage, and has a lot of reach. On top of all of this, some of his moves are usually uninterruptible without a block, so if I don't make him stagger through damage, I usually get stuck in the middle of a stun lock and end up getting comboed in the corner of the shitty arena. I was able to come up with a couple strategies along the way, but nothing I did was 100% effective. Because he was weak to fire, and he would constantly run at me at the beginning of the fight, using a fire canister where I was standing would usually give some time for him to sit in the pool of fire to build up some status. This strategy was especially useful when one of his moves where he digs under the ground, cause I would always use a canister before getting sent flying in the air, and he would just sit in the pool while waiting before moving again. Another strategy I came up with was to constantly use last resort at the Stargazer before the fight, as if I did that, I could get a Fable every time I died and picked up my lost Urgo, because of one of the P-Organs upgrades that I've gotten. Now, in preparation, I did waste like 10 minutes fighting a bear to get an item I didn't actually need, because I didn't remember where the corrosive converter was, but that isn't as important. But in the end, with pure luck and a lot of items, the green monster did eventually go down. Now, with this boss Urgo, the amulet was useless, and the weapon has a Fable which can dodge for some pretty high Fable costs, but does much less damage without a charge attack. So I thought it wasn't gonna do nearly as well as my other weapons, so I ended up just using it to get more Urgo, which ended up being the worst decision I made in this run. But anyways, on to Cross Station Part 2. I grabbed a quick quartz and went through the station. The Caucasus army did take me down a couple times, but it wasn't too bad. I was able to get a useless amulet and a much more useful cartridge piece, but there wasn't too much else pickups to talk about. Now, there was the Stalker, the Robber Weasel, but other than dodging enough to make me spend all my items, it wasn't enough of a problem to really constitute any plans. In the station, I did find a new farming spot though, which was able to farm a lot more Urgo than my previous areas, which is cause of this one enemy giving a whole 60 more Urgo than all the other enemies in the area. Along with how close it was to the Stargazer, letting me farm a lot faster and with a lot more item drops possible. Going through the rest of Krat and collapsing Krat was not that bad either. There wasn't really any super bad enemies in Krat Station, except for this one headbanging rat. Smaller rooms with fast moving enemies are shitty when there's no way to dodge. So the best thing I could do was just to make sure that he couldn't move and died before he was able to stunlock me. On the other hand, Walker of Illusions, the boss of the area, she was very easily beaten by just throwing a couple of items, then running to the ladder to reset aggro, and then repeating it over and over again. Now, it becomes an actual challenge, cause the next area or boss can actually softlock me out of the run. Corrupted Parade Master, on paper, is a very easy boss. He is very telegraphed and has similar moves to Parade Master, the very first boss of the game. And he has very low HP compared to some of the previous bosses that we just went against. But the catch is that you can't teleport anywhere and you're stuck in this region until you beat the boss. This normally isn't a problem, because you can beat him with a +0 weapon and pretty low levels, as that's what I did on my first run. But in this run, having no way to teleport would mean that I would be stuck here with no way of getting more items if I run out. And if I ran out of items, I would be stuck in here with almost no way to beat him, except for maybe Legion, if that even did enough damage. Because of this, I had to prepare all I could just to make sure I wouldn't get stuck here. going to get all the cryptids to get through Homet's cave and get 2 quartz, getting +4 on my holy arc, and then farm for so long in order to just have enough items to have 3 runs of the boss. And this was assuming I used every single item per run, so around 21 of each item. This run, I was really not ready for. Pretty scared that all my efforts this run would just go to waste. But then, the first run was horrible, and the other runs just as hard. There's one move that I would abuse all the time in my normal run to get 4 blocks in a row, but that just ends up putting me in a stun lock for almost all of my HP in this run. But with a lot of luck, I was finally able to beat him, with barely enough items to just have one more attempt if I failed the one I was on. But with the quartz Corrupted Parade Master gave me, I had just enough quartz to get to P-Organ 5, with just 1 quartz remaining. So I reset my P-Organ to instead give me Fable if I used the Pulse Cell instead of dying, as well as getting a Trinity Key from a phone booth before. Now going through the painting to the painted world, the Relic of Trismegistus. I get the final Trinity Key and go to the fight. The Black Rabbit Hood again. This fight is actually pretty scary because of how many enemies there are. I need to defeat all 3 of the younger siblings this time, and then the reincarnated corpse of the eldest. 3 enemies at once makes dodging really difficult and saving items even more difficult. By the time I got to the eldest, I used almost all of the remaining items, just to half health and stagger him. Then, with his final struggle after a stagger, I used my Fable to finish him off 4 quartz. And in addendum, there is a strategy to this fight. The eldest brother only spawns after there is only 1 enemy left. So the strategy is to kill 2 of the siblings at the same time, the last 2, so that the enemy won't spawn at the same time as us fighting any of the other siblings. With the fight done, we meet Alidoro, which he admits to betraying the hotel, and we are given the option to attack him. And he dies to a Sawtooth Wheel, which does 61 damage. Pathetic. We then pick up the final Vanini box, and head to the final area of the game, Ark Abbey. Walking through memories, I get to the entrance, which has a couple scorpions which are really fast, and a whole lot of cannons which constantly shoot at me. The good thing is, once the cannons and scorpions are taken down, they don't respawn. So I just need to spend some time to clear it out so I don't die every time I walk. Then, I enter the doors and meet the Door Guardian. He is a very slow moving enemy, and very predictable when he is attacking. He is the game's gimmick boss, where you have to use Fados to deal with him, otherwise you don't do much damage to him. In normal play, his difficulty comes from his special effects, which apply break, where if you get hit, it reduces your stamina regen significantly, so you run out of stamina to dodge or swing at him. You would think it literally doesn't matter this run, and that's exactly right, the special effect doesn't. But even though he's slow, his attacks are fucking huge. It is impossible to walk out of the range of his attacks whenever he swings, and his attacks are exactly slow enough that his next attack is exactly when I stand back up. Which means, unless I get sent really far away, and he doesn't instantly jump onto me after, I get stuck in a loop of either taking damage instantly, or getting a heal off and instantly getting hit right after. If only I had a dodge, or something that could evade the attack. Not like there's anything in the game that I just skipped over, right? On top of all of this, the walk back from the Stargazer to the entrance of the boss arena was 80 seconds, just to get stun locked or comboed by the boss yet again. At least when I fabled him, it did half his HP, but I had to learn exactly how to deal with all his moves, and at the end, I ended up improving Flameberg twice, so that it would have increased range and more damage over time. By some miracle, I beat him, after 3 hours of attempts and 44 tries. God, I hate my life. That is the face of a man dying inside. The next part of Ark Abbey was really easy. Just walk through and make sure I got the quartz from Valentino behind the Chosen One's Trinity door, talk to the subject to let him out, and get the last emotion needed for the best boy. Now, I had to meet the Black Cat. This was where I decided whether or not to do all bosses this challenge. And because I never fought him before, I decided I would do all the bosses. And he was kinda a pushover. But given the fact that he's a disabled orphan who can't see or move a lot, kinda makes sense. After ruining the dreams of any disease being cured, I went back to kill the other 2 optional bosses. First going back to survival, which is a lot easier when I'm over 40 levels higher than I was at the first time I fought him, and the Arc Doctor, who was a bad arena, but with enough consumables, went down. Going through the next part of Ark Abbey and making sure I had the next 2 quartz, I got my Holy Arc to +5, the max it could be. Finally, what is considered the hardest boss in the game, Lysaxia. She's really fast and strong, with long combos. And she's dead first try. I am actually so confused. How was I able to do the hardest boss in the game first try, but the Door Guardian took me forever? I was preparing for this fight, with the Deus Ex Machina, which I never used, and so many other strategies, but no, she died so fast for what? And now we meet Sophia, where I gave her peace, and got the fire requirement for the true ending. The biggest reveal in the game, which was supposed to be really emotional. Anyways, we just walk through the rest of the abbey and pick up the quartz on the way. With how much more HP the normal enemies have, it takes me a few tries to walk through and get a shortcut. And then now, the Red Fox. She was actually a really difficult fight. She attacks fast and has long combos which I cannot walk out of. But with enough staggers, I am able to beat her 4th try. Now, I'm on the final stretch of the game. There's only one important pickup, a quartz from an elite enemy, which I applied the last 2 quartz of the 28 total I could have gotten this patch to my P organ and got the golden lie. Now, the final boss of Ark Abbey, Simon Manus. He's pretty fast, but honestly, the coolest thing I did was injecting drugs while slowly walking away from the beams of death. But he was actually pretty easy, especially with the amount of items I had, which allowed me to beat him 2nd try. Now, with all those bosses out of the way, I maxed out the big pipe wrench head, all the way to +10, and got on the police baton for no major reason. None at all that could be important. Then, I talked to Geppetto in the basement of the Ark Abbey, and refused to give my heart to Geppetto, which, for refusing, I am faced with the nameless puppet, the actual final boss of the game. Actually, probably one of the hardest bosses, which is not completely luck based. This fight was actually not as infuriating as Door Guardian, but it was just as hard in a skill based way. I had gotten a few strategies for this fight, such as using the baton handled Fable for extra attack and using the Wretch Fable for a big chunk of damage in the beginning. Along with the Extreme Mod Amulet, I'm able to do more damage the more Fable bars I have charged, so I made sure I had the max amount when I started. After the first couple tries, I changed my P organ upgrades to better suit my current strategy of Fables and consumables rather than Legion. The first phase was always pretty easy, but the second phase was much harder because of how much he moved and how fast his combos were. But by the end, I had it figured out, and it was amazing. First phase was clean with only a couple hits, which were difficult to dodge at all, and the second phase had a pretty clutch heal which saved me from death. Along with how long his dagger animation was, I could deal a lot of damage after the fatal. I had done it. With a final anime protagonist blow, P defeats the nameless puppet, and I get the true ending of the game. All bosses, true ending with no stamina, no dodging, running, blocking, perfect guard, or even attacking. This run took 30 hours to complete, and even more to edit. So, if you would like to see more runs on Liza P, or any more challenge runs in general, be sure to check out my channel and my Twitch. And if you enjoyed the run, leave a like or subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
I feel good, 'cause I just don't feel like of you. Give it to me, baby. Feel alright. I feel good. Just want you to step with me, dance with me, here with me, feel alright.